Good afternoon on Yom Rishon, Sunday. How's everybody doing? Special time today, noon Pacific, because Nina and I have a family obligation this evening. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Sunday at midday? Nancy, North Carolina. Paul in Chicago. Renee in Indiana. Paul in the Great Northwest. Bella in Florida. Judith in Budapest. Melissa in Great Neck. Lucy in Minnesota. Sharon in New Jersey. Belle in Texas. Cleaning up after a brunch with the kids and grandkids. What a joy. Belle says, thanks, Sal and Nina, and to all. Shandora. Got to do my first Devar Torah ever yesterday after being away from shul, healing from surgery for the past 2 weeks. Thank you, Sal and Nina, for so much insight that helped me study for it. That's so great. So glad to be of use. John in Maine, Joseph in Massachusetts. Ella says shalom. Lynn in North Texas. Marjorie in Georgia. Michelle says shalom. Franco checking in from Trieste. And Howie from PA. Welcome, everybody. Really interesting daf today as we open Mishna number 3 here in chapter 2 of Tractate Gittin, the Laws of the Bill of Divorce. Our daf today is Yud Tes, that's page 19 here in Tractate Gittin, the 19th volume of the Talmud. Mishnah number 3, one may write a bill of divorce with any material that can be used for writing, with deo, with paint, with sikra, with komos, with kankantom, or with anything that produces permanent writing. However, one may not write with other liquids, nor with fruit juice, nor with anything that does not produce permanent writing. Stands to reason we want a get to be a permanent document that the wife, who becomes the ex-wife, can rely on when she remarries, so that her second marriage should be a valid marriage, and she might need to have the evidence of the divorce from the previous husband. And as we saw, this could come up with if she's accused of adultery, or if the husband tries to take the produce of a field that the wife brought into the marriage, and which he's only entitled to while they're married. So once they're divorced, he's not entitled to it. And maybe he tries to take it during a period when he was not entitled to it, and the wife takes him to court, and she wants the produce returned to her. So this is the evidence that she's going to rely on, is the get. Now, similarly, with regard to the document itself, meaning the paper, one may write on anything, even on an olive leaf or the horn of a cow. And the latter is valid if he gives her the entire cow. Likewise, one may write a bill of divorce on the hand of a slave. And that is valid if he gives her the slave. Rabbi Yosei HaGalili disagrees and says one may not write a bill of divorce on any living thing, nor may it be written on food. Very interesting about what can you write on. Where did the law end up? It is permitted to write a bill of divorce on anything. If one wrote it on the hand of a slave or on a cow's horn, then it is valid, but he must give the woman, the slave, or the cow in the presence of witnesses, right? So at the end of the day, we want that document to survive. We want it to be a document that can be referred to in the future. But we're concerned that, okay, even if it doesn't become a document that survives, nevertheless, he wrote the words of the bill of divorce and he handed it to her in the presence of witnesses, and witnesses were there when he signed it. Might be the same witnesses for the writing and for the giving, but it's definitely witnessed, and those witnesses at the end of the day are the ones that can testify as to the veracity that this divorce happened, right? So we're not going to say that if there's no surviving document, the divorce didn't happen, because in fact, he wrote it properly, it was witnessed properly, it was given to her properly. So you can't say that it is not a divorce. We would prefer that there be a document that she can refer to, but we're not going to say that it's not a divorce if there's no surviving document. And then where it's tricky is with these inks that might be ink, it might not be ink. Is it legible? How long was it legible? So let's get into the details a little bit with the Gemara. The Gemara begins by explaining the terms used in the Mishnah. Deo. This refers to what is called deota, ink, in the language of Aramaic. Sam. This refers to sama, arsenic. With regard to sikra, Rabba Bar Chana said its name in Aramaic is sikreta, which is a red dye derived from minium, which is also known as red lead. Komos, this is tree resin, and it is known as kuma in Aramaic. And with regard to kankantom, Rabba Bar Chana said that Shmuel said this is the black substance used by cobblers, copper sulfate, right? So you can imagine that the black that a shoemaker uses to blacken shoes. Why not use that? I mean, this is going to definitely produce a permanent mark when it's inscribed into some kind of paper. Now, the Mishnah taught that one is allowed to write a bill of divorce with anything that produces permanent writing. And the Gemara asks, this statement is meant to add what? The Gemara answers, to add what Rabbi Hanina taught. If he wrote it with meiteriya, or water in which gall nuts, aftza, were soaked, well, then it is valid, as the writing is permanent. Rabbi Chia teaches if he wrote it with lead, with coals, or with black paint, it is a valid get. It was stated that there was a related discussion about different types of writing. In the case of one who passes ink over letters written in red dye on Shabbos, Rabbi Yochanan, right, so the red dye was written, which is not considered real writing, before Shabbos, and then on Shabbos, he's writing the black letters over the black letters. So is this actually writing or not, is the question. Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish both say, right, often we see disputes between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, here they agree, both say that this person is liable, not only to bring a sin offering for writing on Shabbos, but to bring two sin offerings for this. One, due to violating the prohibition against writing on Shabbos, right? Writing on Shabbos is one of the prohibited malachos, one of the prohibited labors that you cannot do on Shabbos. And as we learned in Tractate Shabbos, I believe the minimum measure to be liable for violating that prohibition is if you write two letters, right? If you write one letter, maybe not by Torah law, but certainly by rabbinic law, you don't write any letters. But here, where you're just writing letters over other letters, does this violate Shabbos? Yes, it certainly does. You violated the prohibition of writing on Shabbos, and you violated also the prohibition on erasing on Shabbos, because your black letters that are covering the red letters are actually erasing the red letters. And so you violated two prohibitions, both writing and erasing on Shabbos. Now you might think, why would erasing be one of the malachos that are prohibited on Shabbos, one of the forbidden labors? Isn't it destructive? Isn't it really creative labors that are prohibited on Shabbos? And the answer is that just as, if you've ever done a construction project around the house, very often the first part of construction is demolition, right? Removing the old to make way for the new. And so that's considered part of construction. And likewise, if you erase letters, well, what have you done? You've made a blank parchment to write new letters. And so that's also considered part of the constructive act of writing. So this person both erased and wrote, and he's liable to bring sin offerings for two violations of Shabbos. Now, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish also agree in the case of ink written on top of ink, or red dye on top of red dye, that according to everyone, he is exempt because he changed nothing with his writing. However, if he wrote with red dye on top of ink, then some say he is liable and some say he is exempt. And the Gemara explains these opinions. Some say that he is liable because it is erasing, as he erases the higher quality original writing of the black ink with this new red ink. And some say that he is exempt because he is destroying, and one who acts destructively is exempt as he has not performed planned constructive labor on Shabbos. Now, this dispute pertains to the laws of Shabbos. With regard to the signing of documents, Reish Lakish raised a dilemma before Rabbi Yochanan. If there are witnesses who do not know how to sign their names, what is the law? May their names be written for them with red dye, and afterwards they will sign on top of it with black ink. And the question is the upper writing, which was not directly on the document but on top of other ink, considered to be writing, or is it not writing? And he said to him, it is not writing. Consequently, this may not be done for witnesses who do not know how to sign. Right? And so now we see why. We encountered this halacha, this law a little bit earlier, that if you want a witness to a get, to a bill of divorce, and he's illiterate, he's unable to sign his name, can he be a valid witness? And the answer was, yes, he can. How is this possible? He can't sign his name. How is he going to read the document that he's witnessing? Answer, they read the document to him, somebody who is trustworthy to not misread it. He hears it, it's read what's right in front of him. And then, since he's unable to sign his name, we create a little bit of a stencil for him, like a cutout in a piece of paper, and then he traces, his name inside of that stencil, and that's considered a valid signature. Here they're suggesting, well, why not kind of outline it with a pen, kind of with a light red ink, and then he can sign black ink on top of the red ink. Why isn't that a valid way for this illiterate witness to trace his name and thereby make a valid signature? Answer, he's not signing the document. He's signing his ink on top of other ink, and that renders it not an actual signature, even though afterwards all we're going to see is black ink. They're saying, no, that's not the right way to do it. Reish Lakish then said to Rabbi Yochanan, but didn't our master, meaning you, Rabbi Yochanan, teach us that the upper writing is considered to be writing with regard to the laws of Shabbos? And Rabbi Yochanan said to him, and because we compare the laws pertaining to bills of divorce to the laws of Shabbos, shall we perform an action and teach that a bill of divorce may be written in this manner? In other words, we're being stringent in both cases for different reasons. We don't want people doing this writing on Shabbos. We want them doing any kind of writing. And so we're going to be stringent and say that even if you're, tracing over this red ink with your black ink on Shabbos, that is writing. It does leave a permanent mark, and you're erasing the red ink that was below, so you have violated Shabbos. That doesn't mean that we're going to consider this writing in terms of accepting the signature as a valid signature on a shtar, on a financial contract, on a document. So even though it's a different outcome, it's not that we're being inconsistent in our reasoning. Now, it was stated that there was a dispute with regard to the following question. What should be done for witnesses who do not know how to sign? And Rav says one tears a blank paper for them. This is the stencil that I mentioned earlier. And the witnesses then fill in the gaps with ink so that their names appear on the document, right? The key difference is they're not writing ink over some other kind of dye. They're just writing ink directly on the paper. And how do they know where to go? Because of the stencil you created. And Shmuel says one first writes their names on the document with lead, and the witnesses write over those letters. Okay, we're saying with a pencil. It's like you write their name with pencil, and then they put ink over the pencil. And you might say, well, isn't that the same as putting the black ink over the red ink, which you just said is not allowed? And I suppose maybe the difference here is that with lead, it's not fully covering the surface of the material, right? When you write with a pencil, you haven't fully covered the surface of the paper, of the document, the parchment, and so when ink comes along, it actually is penetrating through the lead. What's the halakha? If one wrote a bill of divorce with lead, coal, or paint, it is valid, right? So you could do the writing with lead. However, these substances should not be used lechatchila, right? Should not be used ab initio, as in this case, the phrase, if he wrote it, indicates that this law applies only after the fact. We would prefer that he not write with lead, because it's not considered permanent writing, and okay, he did it, and so we're not going to penalize her that she didn't get a valid get. We're going to say it is a get, but it would be preferable not to do it that way. And so we understand, and that's maybe why we could say that lead can be used as the tracing for somebody who's illiterate to come and sign their name in ink over the lead outline. Now the Gemara asks, would it enter your mind to say that they actually write for them with lead? But didn't Rabbi Chia teach if he wrote it with lead, with coals, or with black paint, then it is valid, and it can be seen from this baraisa that writing with lead is considered to be a valid form of writing. And as Rabbi Yochanan taught, if one writes on top of other writing, then the second writing is not accepted for the signing of documents. And the Gemara answers, this is not difficult. This, that Shmuel allowed the witnesses to sign on top of lead writing, applies only when the first writing was done with lead itself, which is not considered to be writing on its own. And that, Rabbi Chia's statement that it is valid for writing a bill of divorce applies only when the first writing was using lead water, i.e. water colored black with lead. Now, Rabbi Abahu said a solution would be to write the names for those witnesses, again, the ones who are illiterate and can't sign. So Rabbi Abahu suggests you write their names for them with gall water, mei milin, and have them trace their names with ink. And the Gemara challenges, but didn't Rabbi Hanina teach that if you wrote a bill of divorce with mei teria or water in which gall nuts were soaked, then it is valid? As this is so, any additional writing over the writing in gall water should not be accepted as a valid signature. In other words, if you can write a get and it's a valid get using some kind of a substance, then how can you say that for illiterate people we would use that same substance and have them trace their name in ink over that kind of writing? If it was valid writing for the get to begin with, then writing on top of that should not be considered a valid signature. That's the contradiction. The Gemara answers, this is not difficult. This suggestion of Rabbi Abahu that the document be prepared with the names of the witnesses written with gall water refers to a case where the parchment was processed with gall nuts. That statement of Rabbi Hanina that gall water may be used on its own to write a bill of divorce refers to a case where the parchment was not processed with gall nuts. And the reason for the difference is because gall water is not permanent when applied on top of gall water, i.e. a parchment that was processed with gall nuts. Therefore, the parchment was processed using gall nuts. The writing of the names of the witnesses done with gall water will not be permanent, and the witnesses may sign their names on top of that writing. When the Baraisa states that witnesses may sign their names with gall water, it is referring to a case where the parchment was not processed with gall nuts, so the gall water signature will be permanent. Rav Papa said a solution would be to write the names for these witnesses with saliva and have them trace their names with the ink. And so Rav Papa instructed Papa, the ox herder, who did not know how to sign his name, here's a real incident, that the court should write his name with saliva and he should trace it with ink. And the Gemara comments, this matter, the leniency to have the witnesses trace their names, applies only to bills of divorce, as there is concern that witnesses will not be found and the woman will be unable to remarry. However, for all other financial documents, the sages did not allow this, and one must instead find witnesses who know how to sign their names. So we normally do not allow an illiterate witness to sign as a witness on a financial document where we want him to understand what it is that he's signing and to be able to actually sign his name. But we're going to have a leniency in the get, in the bill of divorce, because maybe another witness won't be found and they won't have another chance to get the get signed properly, and then this woman will end up being an aguna, a stranded woman who is not able to remarry because she remains attached to this husband that wanted to divorce her and she wanted to be divorced from, and yet they couldn't produce a valid get, and so she's stuck. Right, so that's why the sages are finding certain leniencies that apply to a get, but don't apply to other financial documents. It is told that there was a certain person who performed an action and allowed witnesses to trace their names in the case of other documents, not a get, right? We just read that's not allowed. It's only for the get because of the leniency, lest she become an aguna. For other documents should not be allowed. So here was some scribe or rabbi who allowed this to be done for another document. And what was the result? Rav Kahana ordered that man, the scribe or the rabbi who allowed people to sign their name in this way who were illiterate, be flogged for doing so. It was absolutely wrong to allow this in the case of a document that's not a divorce document. Now we're on 19b. It is taught in a baraisa in accordance with the opinion of Rab, in the case of witnesses who do not know how to sign, one tears a blank piece of paper for them and they fill in the gaps with ink, right? As we've read already a couple of times. That's how an illiterate witness signs on a get. They make a little stencil for him. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel said, in what cases this statement said? For bills of divorce. However, for bills of manumission, right, in the ancient times when there was slavery, a document that would free a slave, do we allow the illiterate witness to sign it? No. For the bill of manumission and for other documents, if the witnesses know how to read and sign their names, then they may sign. And if they do not know how to read and sign their names, they do not sign such documents. And the Gemara asks, with regard to reading, who mentioned anything about it? Why does Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel mention the need for witnesses to be able to read when the discussion is about a witness who does not know how to sign? And the Gemara answers the baraisa is incomplete, and this is what it is teaching. In the case of witnesses who do not know how to read, one reads the document in their presence and then they sign it. And in the case where they do not know how to sign, then one makes the little stencil and they fill in the gaps with ink. Now, with regard to this, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel said, in what case is this statement said? For bills of divorce. However, for bills of manumission and for all other documents, if the witnesses know how to read and how to sign, then they sign. And if not, they do not sign. And Rabbi Lazar says, what is the reason of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, who permitted this only for bills of divorce? And he holds that there is a reason to be lenient with bills of divorce so that the daughters of Israel will not become stranded women. Requiring literate witnesses for bills of divorce could lead to a scenario in which a husband wishes to travel and wants to give his wife a bill of divorce in case he shall not return. But if he does not find literate witnesses, he may leave without divorcing her, and then he never returns, and she's stranded because she has no proof that he's dead, has no divorce document, and she can never remarry. So to prevent that from happening, they made the leniency that an illiterate witness can sign a get using the stencil. But wasn't there a certain person who performed an action and allowed witnesses to trace their names in case of other documents that were not bills of divorce? And Rav Kahana ordered that he be flogged for doing so. And the Gemara answers, Rav Gamda interpreted the statement of Rava only with regard to reading, meaning that the law is in accordance with the rabbis and not Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, only with regard to the question of whether other documents may be read to witnesses, but not with regard to whether they may sign other documents by means of a stencil. It is told that Rav Yehuda was nearly blind in his old age. He could barely read, and he took great pains to read and sign documents as a witness or a judge. Ula said to him, "It is not necessary for you to do this, as the court scribes would read in the presence of Rabbi Elazar the master, i.e. the halakhic authority of Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, and then he would sign. And the court scribes would read documents before Rav Nachman, and he would sign. And you may do the same," right? Especially in old times. I don't know. I'm pretty sure that in Talmudic times they didn't have eyeglasses. Right? So if you got old and you absolutely couldn't read, but you were still a competent judge, they would have somebody read it to you. You don't have to take this incredible labor, like focus and try to, read it with eyesight that has deteriorated with age. So why do you feel that you have to do this, Rav Yehuda? Ula is saying to him. Other, sages did not rely on their own reading, but allowed scribes to read it to them. And the Gemara notes, and this was done specifically in a case like that of Rav Nachman and the court scribes, as they had fear of him because he was a great man and the judge to whom they were subservient. Therefore, there was no concern that they would misread it in some way, either by mistake or on purpose. However, for Rav Nachman and other scribes, or the court scribes and another person, no, the document may not be read to the witness, as the scribes may read it incorrectly to him. Now, the Gemara recounts the behavior of another Amora. An Amora is a rabbi of the period of the Gemara. So there was another Amora who had documents read to him. When documents that were written in Persian and that were produced in Gentile courts came before Rav Papa, who did not know how to read Persian, he would have it read by two Gentiles, each one not in the presence of the other, and in a way that each one would speak offhandedly without knowing that they were giving testimony. And once he clarified what was written in the documents, he would collect payment with it, even from liened property that had been sold, as he held that such a document is entirely valid with regard to monetary law. In other words, Rav Papa was saying, under Jewish law, we can't rely on contracts written outside of Jewish law. So, for example, in a Gentile court in the Persian Empire at that time. But what he would do, but he wouldn't say that such documents are automatically disqualified from ever being used to collect a payment of a debt in a Beis Din, in a rabbinic court. Rather, he would say we have to take extra steps to verify that the document, says what it purports to say, that it is authentic, and when it's being translated for the rabbis in the rabbinic court, we have to verify that the translation that some Persian is coming along to give, or even a Jew is coming along to give, that it's going to be, verified and authenticated as a good translation. You can't just have one guy come before the court, give his translation, and now you're relying on that guy and his ability to translate alone, right? Normally, you need two witnesses for lots of reasons. And if you just rely on one translator, what you've actually done is introduced another source of potential inaccuracy and variance, right? And that's something worth remembering. We just take a step back for a second. I'm teaching this to you in English. The Gemara is mostly written in Aramaic. It's commenting on the Mishna that was written in Hebrew. And every time we go through a translation, or where this is most relevant, is when you're reading the Bible. Right? When you're reading the Bible that was written in Hebrew and you're reading an English translation, if it's a good English translation that was conducted by a very reputable place like Art Scroll or Koren, where they hire a team of translators who are well versed in the Jewish tradition and the interpretations of Rashi and Rambam and the whole tradition of our commentaries and commentators. So then you can be confident that you're reading a translation that expresses the intent of the Torah and the rest of the Tanakh as we understand it in our tradition, because every translation is an interpretation. You have to be very careful when you're learning in English. And so even I, with my, quite weak Hebrew skills, whenever I'm learning Torah, I try to get into the Hebrew and sort of, at this point for biblical Hebrew, I can usually kind of work it out. I know most of the roots. And if I'm just going very slowly and word by word, I can make out how the Hebrew is put together. And it's very instructive to do that once your Hebrew is even at that minimum level, to compare that to how the English works, because Hebrew and English are such different languages. I mean, not just the construct and the structure of where verbs and nouns go and how adjectives are used, but also the Hebrew has much fewer words. It's a much moodier language. And so the same word gets used in different contexts in different ways. There's all kinds of, sound and rhyming, and the whole Bible is very poetic. And the way God dictated the Torah to Moses, includes a wonderful musicality of language, which if you can tap into it all, just enriches the experience of learning Torah so much, right? And it's worth noting that, whenever we have to learn in English, because that's our primary language, and look, even the sages were much, tended to be more comfortable in Aramaic than in Hebrew. And certainly the regular people at that time, Aramaic was to them what English is to us. Now, they were lucky that Aramaic and Hebrew are much, much more similar to each other than English and Hebrew are. But nonetheless, whenever we're working in translation, tread softly. Go cautiously. Try to get at the original language and the intent of the language. All right, let's go back to where we were. Now, the Gemara asked, in this case, right, where Rav Papa would have two independent translators tell him what was written in a Persian, legal document before he would rely on it to give a ruling in his rabbinic court. The Gemara asks, but they don't know how to read, as most Jews at that time did not read Persian. And the Gemara answers, Rav Ashi said that Rav Huna bar Nassan said to me that so said a Maimar, with regard to this Persian document on which Jews are signed as witnesses, the court is able to collect payment with it even from liened property that had been sold. Meaning, liened property that had been sold, and then somebody comes along and says, you were not allowed to sell that property, I had a lien on it, I want that property brought back to me, taken away from the purchaser and given to me because of my lien, L-I-E-N. That's a very strong insertion of the court's power into a transaction to undo it because of that prior existing lien. And we're not going to take such an action in the absence of very strong evidence. And you might think, well, that evidence for the purposes of a Beis Din, a rabbinic court, would only be a Hebrew document written, with Jewish witnesses who understood what they were doing in a kind of, Jewish traditional context. So taking a document written in Persian, even though there are Jewish witnesses to it, might be problematic. They're saying, no, we can establish, through good translation, what that Persian document said, and we will use it even to undo a purchase when previously liened property was the subject of the transaction. Now, the Gemara asks, but they don't know how to read. As most Jews at that time in the Persian Empire, right, which is the Babylonian Jewish community, was within the Persian Empire. And so that's the community we're talking about. But so most Jews there didn't know how to read Persian. I'm surprised about that, but let's continue. And the Gemara answers, a Maimar's statement applies when they do know how to read Persian. And the Gemara questions how the court can rely on such a document. But don't we require all legal documents to be written in a writing that cannot be forged? And it is not so in documents produced by the Persians, as the Persians were not particular about this when writing their legal documents. They had different standards for creating purchase and sale and other kinds of legal contracts than the rabbinic courts did. And the Gemara answers, his statement applies in a case where the paper of the document was processed with gall. Consequently, it is not possible to forge the writing. But we require a document to recap the essential topic of the document in its last line. And this is a requirement we have in our legal documents, but the Persians didn't have in their legal documents. So how can we rely on a legal document created in their court? And the Gemara answers, a Maimar's statement applies in a case where the document recapped the essential topic of the document in the final line. In other words, it might have been written in Persian, but it had to be written in such a way as to satisfy the legal requirements for the elements of a transactional document as would hold up in a rabbinic court. So the Gemara asks, but if a Maimar's statement applies only when all these conditions are met, then what is he teaching us that a document is properly written in any language, that a document that is properly written in any language is valid? We already learned in a Mishna, in the case of a bill of divorce, that a man wrote in Hebrew and its witnesses signed in Greek, or one that he wrote in Greek and its witnesses signed in Hebrew, it is a valid get. So if this is written in the Mishnah, a Maimar's statement would not simply repeat it. What is he coming to add? And the Gemara answers, this cannot serve as a clear proof, because if the only source for this law were from that Mishnah that you mentioned, I would say that statement only applies to bills of divorce, where the sages were lenient so that a woman would not become stranded. However, for other documents, no. Consequently, a Maimar teaches us that other types of documents are valid if written in other languages as well. And I think that is the law. That's where this discussion ends. Let's just go back to halacha. If a document was produced by a Gentile court in any language, and it was written in accordance with the strictures of Jewish law that prevent the forging of documents, a type of paper, type of ink, the recapping statement at the end of the document, etc., and the witnesses signed on the document were Jews who knew how to read the language of the document produced in the Gentile court, then it is a valid document and it may be used to collect payment even from liened property in accordance with the statement of a Maimar. So that is the law. So in other words, if you're talking about documents produced in English that are used in American courts of law or in, arbitration, etc., that will also hold up in a Beis Din, in a rabbinic court, provided these other elements are met. Now, Shmuel says, if a man gave his wife a blank piece of paper and said to her, this is hereby your bill of divorce, what do we think? Is she divorced? I mean, now we've gone through all kinds of discussion. Is it a valid get if it's written on this kind of paper or on that leaf or even the horn of an animal or the hand of a slave? It has to be written with permanent ink and maybe, paint and coal and lead is okay after the fact. It shouldn't be done initially. Okay, a lot of variables there. But it would seem if a husband says, here, this is your bill of divorce. Is she divorced? A blank piece of paper? Really? Could that possibly be a valid get? Shmuel says, if a man gave his wife a blank piece of paper and he said to her, this is hereby your bill of divorce, then she is divorced. How is this possible? Why? Why would he say that? We are concerned that perhaps he wrote it with gall water, rendering it a valid bill of divorce, and the writing was subsequently absorbed into the paper so that it was no longer visible. Disappearing ink, but it's there, we just can't see it. So he wrote a valid get that witnesses watched him write it, and he signed it in their presence, and then they signed it. And then he took this document that is a valid get in every way, and then the ink just faded really fast. But somehow it's there. That's why it's a valid get. So we can't just willy-nilly say, what are you talking about? That's a blank piece of paper. You can't hand that to her and call it a divorce and say she's divorced. But it was a valid get. It's just that the ink faded. Since we don't want to just automatically say no because, it disappeared, it's no good. So she's not really divorced. She can't remarry. That might produce an aguna. That might produce a stranded woman. We actually want to be lenient to her and say that is a valid get. But of course, there's going to be some limitations on this. Now, the Gemara raises an objection based on what was taught in a Baraisa, Tosefta 8:2. If a husband said to his wife, this is hereby your bill of divorce, and instead of opening it and looking at it, she took it and she threw it into the ocean or into a fire or into anything that destroys the get. And the husband later said, it wasn't actually a bill of divorce. Rather, it is a document of appeasement, a symbolic promissory note meant only for display so that the person holding it will be considered to be wealthy. Or he said it is a document of trust which is a false promissory note given by one person to another, trusting that he will not make use of it until there has been an actual loan, then she is divorced, right? He gave her a valid get. She never read it. She just threw it in the fire. And later he lies and says, no, it wasn't really a get. It was something else. But it was a get. There were witnesses that saw him write the bill of divorce and sign it, and then he handed it to her. Now, the fact that she didn't read it and she threw it in the fire doesn't mean she didn't receive it. So it was a valid get received by the wife, and later he lies and changes his testimony and says it wasn't really a get because they want to stay married. But no, he gave her a valid get and she received it, and it's irrelevant that he later said it was something different or that she right away threw it in the fire. It was a valid get and she received it. And so she is divorced. And he does not have the power to make her forbidden to everyone else as a married woman by saying that it was not a valid bill of divorce and that they are still married. We don't believe him for that, and she is divorced. Why are we bringing this up? So the Gemara makes an inference from this baraisa. The reason that she is divorced is because this bill of divorce has writing. And there is no way to ascertain what was written because she threw it in the fire. But if it did not have writing, then no. There is no concern that perhaps it was a valid bill of divorce written with gall water. Right? In other words, the witnesses saw it. This was handed to her, and that's why it's a valid get. But if we are to say that there was never any writing on that document, then it would not be a valid get. So the Gemara says, when Shmuel said that a woman was divorced, that a woman who was divorced with a blank piece of paper is in fact divorced, it was in a case where we check the paper with colored water, known as Maya Dinara. And if the paper expels the writing, then it expels it, and it is a valid bill of divorce. And if it does not expel it, then the document is nothing and she is not divorced. So that blank piece of paper is only an apparent blank piece of paper. And this is like those, toy stuff that you could buy when you were a kid, like, spy writing. It's disappearing ink, but you can bring it back, right? Or it's almost like, a private eye searching a hotel room where the bad guy was. There's no evidence there, but he goes to the pad of paper that's next to the phone. There's nothing written there, but he takes, the soft lead pencil and he just brushes lightly over the pad, and where there was a little bit of an indent from what was written on the piece of paper above it, he can make out what was written there, right? And so in a sense, writing was on that piece of paper. It disappeared because it was some kind of disappearing ink, but we can prove that it was there using this, this colored liquid that brings back the trace of the ink that had been there before. So if we can do that, okay, it was a valid get. But if we can't do that, then maybe there was never any writing on it and we won't take it. Now the Gemara asks, and if the paper expels the writing, what of it? It is possible that only now it expels the writing and the letters become visible. But from the beginning there was no legible writing, and therefore the document should be considered not valid. The Gemara answers that even Shmuel said only, we are concerned. And he does not hold that it is a valid bill of divorce. Rather, the court takes into account the possibility that what he gave her in the beginning was a valid bill of divorce, and the law is that it is uncertain if she is divorced or not. It is uncertain. The law. If a man gave his wife a blank paper and said to her, this is hereby your bill of divorce, and the witnesses did not check the paper, or even if they did check the paper and they found it had invisible writing on it, then it is uncertain if she is divorced. If they checked it and no writing was expelled, then there is no concern that this was a valid divorce, right? So the worst case is that we're uncertain, and so she can't rely on that. She's going to have to get a valid get. But if there was no writing on it, and then they checked it, and there was no writing on it, then there's nothing. Nothing happened. Ravina said, Amemar said to me, and so said Maremar in the name of Rabdimi, these two witnesses who testify that the bill of divorce was given in their presence are required to read it. Okay, now, remember, especially the way we started our tractate and with the way we started chapter 2, with the bill of divorce coming from overseas, where the husband wrote it in the presence of two witnesses, and then delivered it by the agent of delivery, and he is obligated to be able to say, that was written in my presence and signed in my presence. And then he's going to bring it to the wife and give it to her. Now, the giving of the get to the wife has to be in the presence of witnesses, or she's not divorced. That's when the bill comes from overseas. When the husband and the wife are in the same place, okay, then it can be the same witnesses who witnessed the writing, the signing, and the handing to her. But now what we're talking about is, well, what is the actual procedure for handing it to her? What happens when the get is handed to her? And it's at that moment that the divorce happens. But is it just hand it to her and we're done? What actually happens? So these two witnesses who testify that the bill of divorce was given in their presence to the wife, they are required to read it. And the Gemara raises an objection to this based on what was taught in a baraisa. If a man says to a woman, this is hereby your bill of divorce, and instead of opening it and looking at it, she took it and threw it in the ocean or into a fire or into anything that destroys it, and he later said it wasn't actually a bill of divorce, but rather it is a document of appeasement or a document of trust or some other kind of document, then she is divorced. And we don't listen to the husband who says it wasn't a bill of divorce, and he does not have the power to make her forbidden to everyone else as a married woman by saying that it was not a bill of divorce. And if you say that the witnesses need to read the bill of divorce, then is the husband able to say this to her after they read it? And the Gemara answers, well, what difference does it make what he says? We don't listen to him. But the Gemara answers, no, it is necessary for Rav Dimi to teach this law in a case where, after they read it, the husband placed it under his arm and later took it out and gave it to the woman without it being read again. Lest you say that he switched it with another document and what he gave her was not a bill of divorce but some other kind of document as he claims. Rav Dimi teaches us that the court need not be concerned that he switched it. And the Gemara tells there was a certain man who threw what he claimed was a bill of divorce to his wife, and he threw it into her courtyard among her barrels, right? So this is another way of handing the get to the wife. Maybe she doesn't want to take it. Maybe you can't put it in her hand, but you can throw it into her domain, right? So it's like received by her if it is placed in her domain, her physical domain. So in this case, this certain man threw this document that he claimed was a bill of divorce, and he threw it into her courtyard among the barrels. And in the end, a mezuzah was found there, right? Meaning the scroll that is inside the covers, right, that we put on the doorposts of our house. The mezuzah, often people think that mezuzah is the thing on the, that we see on the doorposts of a Jewish home or on the gates of a Jewish home, also in the interior doorways. But the mezuzah is the scroll, the written scroll that's inside whatever kind of fancy or unfancy cover you have. So at any rate, he said he threw a get into her domain, and when they searched for it, all they found was a mezuzah, not a get. So what happened? And in the end, a mezuzah was found there. So the question is there a concern that he threw her a real get and the get was destroyed and the mezuzah happened to be in the same location? Or perhaps he threw her the mezuzah and only claimed that it was a get. Rav Nachman said a mezuzah is infrequently placed among the barrels, and it can be assumed that if he threw the mezuzah, and it can be assumed that in this situation, what he threw was a mezuzah and not a get. So the Gemara comments, and this statement applies only when one mezuzah was found. However, if 2 or 3 mezuzahs were found, well then the assumption is that as the other mezuzah was there, so this mezuzah was also there before the husband came. And as to the get, say that the mice later took it and the woman was already divorced from the moment that it reached her courtyard. Now it is told, here's the incident, there was a certain man who entered the synagogue, took a Torah scroll, and gave it to his wife. And he said to her, this is your bill of divorce. Now Rav Yosef said, why would we be concerned about this at all? He gave her a Torah scroll, and he said, this is your get. Why would we listen to him at all? We know it. What is a get? It has to be dated. It has to be written for her sake. It has to have some language about that I'm divorcing you. It has to be written in the presence of witnesses and signed by witnesses and by the husband. And then it has to be given to her in the presence of witnesses. And in this situation, this guy, I don't know, he's crazy or something, is saying, here's your get. We're now divorced. And what he hands her is a Torah scroll. So why would we be concerned that somehow she actually is divorced and this husband and wife are no longer permitted to each other? Why would we even think to be concerned about that? Rav Yosef said, for what is there to be concerned? If you say that there should be a concern due to gall water, and that perhaps he wrote a bill of divorce on the outside of the Torah scroll's parchment with gall water, and this writing is now invisible, gall water is not permanent when applied on top of gall water, and since the parchment for the Torah scroll is processed with gall water, it is not possible to write something with gall water that will remain permanently on the parchment itself. Therefore, there is no concern that he wrote a bill of divorce on the parchment. And I'm almost done. So if you got questions or comments, get them in. Now, if there is a concern, and we're at the top of 28, if there is a concern that the Torah scroll can affect a divorce due to the verses that are written in it concerning the laws of divorce, as for example, Deuteronomy 24:1, it says, and he writes and the law in Deuteronomy 24:1 says within a Torah scroll, and he writes her a scroll of severance. So can he rely on the what's written in the Torah about divorce to then make the Torah into his get to give her? Could he do that? No, this is not problematic, since it is required as it states, and he writes her, right? Has to be specifically written for her. And this indicates that the bill of divorce must be written for her sake. And it cannot be, and this Torah scroll cannot be used as a get that was written specifically for her. And if you would say that there is reason to be concerned that perhaps he gave a dinar to the scribe of the Torah scroll at the outset, and that he said, when you get to the verses of the Torah about divorce, have in mind that this whole Torah scroll really is just being written so that the verse about divorce that's within it is being written as a get for my wife. Should we be concerned about that? And then therefore this is a valid get. But isn't there a need for other things to be written in a get which makes it a valid get? For example, if the scribe changed his name or her name, the name of his city or the name of her city, then the bill of divorce is invalid. And the validity of a bill of divorce depends upon these details being written. Her name, his name, where they live. And those wouldn't be written in a Torah scroll. So how can you say the Torah scroll could ever be a valid get? And the Gemara asks, but if so, what is Rav Yosef teaching us with his statement? It seems obvious that there is no reason why a Torah scroll could ever be used as a bill of divorce. And the Gemara says he is teaching us that gall water is not permanent when applied on top of gall water. And the novel idea is that there is no need to be concerned that the scribe wrote a bill of divorce in gall water on the outside of a Torah scroll. In other words, we shouldn't be concerned that there would be disappearing ink as a get written on the back of the Torah scroll. That's what I've got for us today. I'm going to get a couple comments or questions, and then we'll be continuing with page 20 tomorrow, Monday, at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Now, Nina is not here today, so I'm just scanning the comments. She's not passing me questions. Let me see if I can do this. It's not easy for me to scan. Sharon says, what difference does it make if the ink is permanent and then have them write it on a slave's hand. Sure, it would not remain a permanent document on a person's hand, right, but I guess the fact that it was witnessed and it was properly written, even though it was in this place that couldn't remain permanent, we have to be concerned that it would be a valid divorce procedure. Renee says, when we were kids, we did secret writing in lemon juice that is activated by heat. There you go. We have that memory of disappearing ink. Paula says we'd have to use a time machine and or research if this unspoken of practice was applied. Great Jewish artists like Mark Chagall, Sonia Delany. Are you talking about disappearing ink using something like that? Very interesting. On the subject of translations that I mentioned earlier, Sharon says there are some contemporary translations that are in fact closer to accurate than Art Scroll. For example, Everett Fox, who thoroughly researched concordance, period, typical use of the language, and is very scholarly in its accuracy. And Paul is talking about text messaging, I guess in terms of like disappearing and lack of permanence. Okay, so that's what I've got for us today. So thank you, my friends. It's always great to be learning with you. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, 6 p.m. Pacific,